What the heck is this? Does anybody know? Any viewers out there know what it is? Well, that's going to be our subject tonight. Our subject is New York City subways, and we're not talking about the restaurant. Our guest, back by popular demand, the letters, the telegrams have been unbelievable, is Neal Weiss. We just did this, didn't we, recently?
2 months ago.
We talked about Lionel trains, and Neal mentioned he's an expert in the history of the New York City subway. Neal, what the heck is this? Take it.
Well, it's called a strap. As
Hold it up so they can all see.
People actually riding the subways were known as strap hangers, and this is the way you would stand and hold on. Unfortunately, the modern subway cars of today no longer have the straps. They just have smooth metal bars, so it just is not quite the same. This would give you quite the ride as you were swaying back and forth, riding an Uptown Express train, let's say from 59th Street to 110th Street.
Is that how the derivation, he's a real swinger, came about?
Yeah.
Anyway,
Not
let's
sure.
start off. New York City, fascinating subject. When did it all start?
Well, it opened 1904, October 27th, probably after 5 years of construction. The expression was 15 minutes to Harlem. The subway opened from City Hall to 145th Street, and the ride took 15 minutes
Miracle.
and cost 5 cents.
5 cents. Didn't have any Metro cards or tokens. It was just tickets right back then.
Right. Most people think tokens were the first means of getting into the subway, but prior to tokens, you actually used tickets, and they were called ticket punchers.
Right.
That would have to punch your ticket to allow you entry.
Then they had that oak box where they would chop the tickets.
Ticket
You give it-
choppers,
And then
yes.
it was a ticket chopper.
Ticket choppers.
And I can just see, I can picture the engineer trying to explain this. You know, I want to do this one thing. I want to drill a hole underground and have trains run. I bet he was looked at as a crazy person. You know, really? You know.
Right, but there were two methods of constructing the subway. One was known as cut and cover, where they literally would rip the street up, place the tracks and the walls and everything in the poles for the subway, and then cover the street back over and cover it up. The other way was called tunnel boring, where they literally needed to bore underneath the solid rock foundation of New York City. That was much more expensive. So most of the original subway is cut and cover. And obviously things like traveling under the East River required deep tunnel boring, which was expensive but was required.
Now, who was the engineer who figured all this out?
Well, there were many of them. August Belmont was one of them. He was the financier of the original subway, and he started his own company, the Interborough Rapid Transit Company.
That was the first, right?
That was the first.
IRT,
The IRT, as we affectionately call them, although those expressions have sort of gone out of popular language. And again, soon after opening that first subway, he immediately started expanding. Things about the first subway, though, are interesting. 15 minutes to Harlem, yet Times Square was a local stop.
Really?
Think about that.
A local
Think of
stop
what's,
way back then.
In 1904, the planners of the subway thought Times Square was nothing more than uptown, maybe a few office buildings, but certainly did not warrant an express stop compared to what it is today.
So the city actually made Times Square. You know, they built theaters. It was a big thing, and I
Right.
guess because of the New York City subway system.
Obviously, the New York City subway is the only way the city could have grown. New York City could never have been what it is today without a subway system, since it's literally impossible to move 6 million people a day throughout the city.
How many? 6 million a day
6
on the
million
subway, would
rides, not people. It's 6 million swipes of
Swipes.
a Metro card, and that includes subways, buses, and every type of transportation in New York.
Now, how large? How many miles are we talking about in the New York City subway
Over
system?
720 what are called track miles.
What is a track mile?
Well, for example, if you have 4 tracks running, express and local, you would take the mileage multiplied by 4 to get what we call track miles, as opposed to route miles. Track miles gives you a better indication of physically what needed to be built for the subway.
Now, today, how many subway lines do we have? We have IRT, BMT.
Right. Well, so there are three divisions. There's probably 20 different lines, but they're grouped in the same way as they were originally. You had the original IRT, which today are the numbered trains, the 1 through 7. Then you had the BMT, Brooklyn Manhattan Transit, which are the lettered trains beginning with the letters Q, M, R, etc. Then you have the newest subway, new meaning opened during the 1930s, was known as the Independent Subway, and that's your famous A train, B, C, D, E, F, all the way through the G train.
The A train, you hear Duke Ellington, you got a great evening of jazz, right?
Course.
You can't beat it.
The other thing about the A train is if you want the longest ride on a single subway line without having to change trains, start at 207th Street in Manhattan on the A train, and you go take it all the way to Far Rockaway Beach. Doors open and you smell the ocean air. It is quite the ride.
Hopefully the doors don't open as the train travels,
Right.
because you'd be in the ocean air. Now, you talk about BMT, IRT. Were they all owned by separate companies, separate individuals? How did that work?
The first two companies, IRT and BMT, were owned by separate corporations. Then the city came along, Mayor Highland, that name may be familiar to some people, Highland Boulevard in
Highland
Staten
Boulevard,
Island. Yeah, of
sure,
course.
sure.
He decided to build a independent subway system that was city-owned. And that became known as the independent subway system. And that led to eventually unifying all of the subway systems together under something known as the Transit Authority, the TA.
Yeah,
as
sure.
you have
This is a little operator's badge.
This is an operator's badge from the Transit Authority. TA got incorporated in the late 1940s. And then sometime in the early 1960s, the state took over all of the railroads, trains, subways for the whole state of New York, and it became known as the MTA, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority.
How did that happen that the state took over? I imagine these people were wealthy, they had their own subway lines. Why did they give way to the city?
Because they actually made profit by selling their stake in the subways.
Wow.
Number one, and number two, at some point they probably knew that they needed to let the city own its own subway system.
Wow. Do you have a favorite subway system yourself personally that you enjoy riding?
Right, well, I'm an independent subway guy since that was around the corner from my house. And what's interesting was I took the train to high school. I've been riding the trains for 45 years. It used to say on the sign, 8th Avenue Subway. That was what it said on the kiosk when you went into the yet the subway I took went on 6th Avenue. And I never understood why would it say 8th Avenue
Why?
Subway.
That's a good question.
Yet I was taking a train that would go up 6th Avenue. Well, it turned out when that subway opened, in my neighborhood, there was no 6th Avenue Subway at all. There was only one 8th Avenue Subway that was part of the independent system. It wasn't until the 1940s that they opened the 6th Avenue Subway system.
Now, something happened in 1918 that was considered the biggest disaster in subway history. Tell us a little about
well, I think
what was going on.
an engineer was taking a turn too fast near a street in Brooklyn known as Malburn Street. The train derailed. I think some of the cars may have still had some wood construction in them.
I was going to say wooden cars.
Unfortunately, many people died. I think you
96
know.
people.
So that
passed.
was an incredible disaster. It got so bad where that street name was taken away. It is now known for the Brooklynites in the house. It's known as Empire Boulevard. So that was such a tragic accident that the citizens of New York didn't even want the name of that street to be mentioned, Malburn Street. Like we have no one I think is even old enough to be able to react to it, but Malburn Street had such a bad connotation.
Now, when did we go from the old tickets chopping days to the token days?
That's when
What
it was called unification. It was actually called something known as the dual contracts, where the city actually got the two companies to come together and expand the subway systems. For example, the Queens Boulevard subway, the 4th Avenue subway, extensions of the IRT, and they were sort of done together with these dual contracts. And at that point, they needed to combine both systems, and that's when they came out with the token, probably around 1918, 1920 timeframe.
Because I remember taking a subway at 15 cents for a token.
Right.
Am I really
So it
that
started
old?
as a nickel, and they kept the nickel until I think the nickel lasted until just after World War II. Then it went to a dime, 15 cents. The earliest I remember is 15 cents. And today with Metro cards, we don't even know how much a subway ride is anymore.
We don't.
It's probably $2.50 or so, but
When did they have the dreaded Metro card that never works in the turnstiles and drives you crazy?
well, it was developed in the 80s. It was deployed in the 90s. New York City was different than most subway systems where you would insert the ticket, it would go in, get registered, and come out, and you would grab it. But people, the planners thought New York City people would not want to let that card go. So they made a special turnstile where you hold the card the entire way, but that mechanism doesn't work as well as letting the machine read the card. And we all know what that's like, how many times you repeat yourself. And especially when I notice tourists just can't get
Can't get it
that
right.
touch to,
Yeah, I know.
to operate.
And now you used to have a token booth with a token behind the booth. And
Well,
now everything is machines. So you
Yeah,
rely
but
on the
there's-
machines.
there-
Very few.
Sure, but
people.
there are still some 24-hour token clerks at stations, and people feel safe because of that.
I remember that when the token booths were the old wooden token booths, and they had a guy there who half the time was like, token, And I remember that, and I miss that, because of the safety involved and everything else. But I know they tried to jazz up the subway system. And tell us about it. In 1941, the wonderful Miss Subway contest.
Well, of course, that was a big PR campaign where they would have a beauty contest, and they would put pictures of the contestants on the subway advertisements, and the beauty contest named a Miss Subways. And there were one or two famous Miss Subways. There was one that she owns a restaurant in Manhattan. Her name, Helen's and something. They became famous as Subway, Miss Subway.
So I remember it was Miss Subway on one side and Miss Rheingold on the other side, and they used to fight it out. The two people and the advertiser used to fight it out. When we get back, we are going to talk about something that's absolutely fascinating, and very few people realize this. It's a whole city, unused city. It's unused subway stations that are sitting there under everything that we know. It's like a second level. It's like an Egyptian tomb almost. These old, wonderful subway, including the famous one, City Hall station. So we're going to talk about that when we get back. We're going to do a couple of public service announcements. They're not subway related. So stand by and don't touch that dial.
After 17 years working as a mason, Mike was laid off. I met him when he came into the library looking for help. He found a job opening, but the application was only online. Mike said he'd spent his entire life around tools, but had never used a computer. I showed him how, and he ended up applying for numerous jobs online. I saw Mike the other day. His new computer skills paid off. He's working again.
New Jersey libraries are transforming lives. Tell us your story.
All right, welcome back. And this is the really exciting part of New York City subways, abandoned subway stations. Tell us about it, Neal.
So as the system grew, certain times a subway station would become sort of like an appendage. For example, the original subway stations were only long enough to accommodate 5-car trains. Then they extended the subway stations to accommodate 10-car trains, so a few subway stations ended up being too close to each other, so they closed a few. The first one you think about when you leave Brooklyn Bridge on the 6 train is the Worth Street station. It became too close to Brooklyn Bridge to warrant it being a separate station. There's an abandoned station at 18th Street because they expanded the 14th Street station too close to it. There's also another abandoned station, 90th Street, because there's one at 86 now and 96, so that became just not efficient if you were going to keep all of those stations.
Why
But
did they
they're
build
still
so
there.
close together, though?
Well, originally they weren't
Yeah.
that close because you had shorter trains, so it warranted having the stations that close. And again, this was the beginning of the subway. The planners learned as time went on, stations were built further and further apart to accommodate the longer trains. But you could still see these stations. You have to press your nose against the glass as you leave 14th Street, as an example, and you'll see the station in the dark.
It's amazing.
Another station houses the New York Transit Museum. The Transit Museum itself is in a abandoned 1930s subway station known as Court Street in Court Street, Brooklyn. It was originally designed where local trains would terminate at Court Street in Brooklyn and express trains would continue on into Manhattan. But it just never got used. It opened for only 10 years.
Only 10 years?
Yes, they closed the station, but now it houses the Transit Museum with a great collection of all of the transit cars through the years. The actual cars, because you can go down into the actual station and walk through
Pretty
and
amazing, right?
observe all the cars.
The old
Yes.
subway cars.
Yes.
And they also, you were talking about there's an underground level. It's not used too much by the subway system.
Yeah, 42nd Street and 8th Avenue Station, was a lower level built, and it never really got used for anything, although at one point it was used to run something known as the Aqueduct Express. When I say aqueduct, I mean the racetrack in Brooklyn. So people would board this Aqueduct Express by walking underneath, downstairs from the platform at 42nd Street to get on their special train that took them to Aqueduct. Other uses of it never really panned out, so they eventually just sealed up the level, but it's still there, and it's accessible for tours for people that are going. And through the Transit Museum, if people want information about how to see these stations, the Transit Museum, New York City Transit Museum, has all of that information online.
Now, it seems like a waste, all of these stations, especially that Aqueduct station. Do you think they'll ever be reused?
There's no, because they've not been kept up as far as infrastructure is concerned. So the wiring for the lights, do you realize that today our subway system has fiber optic cables running through the tunnels? And in fact, companies wired themselves to the internet by running fiber optic cables through. The most logical place would be the subway tunnels. So the older stations would not be able to be,
That's a shame. It's
would
like
ever
a
be
waste,
brought
but-
to. Other reasons subway stations were have appendages, levels that were never used because subway lines were never built. Roosevelt Avenue in Queens has an entire mezzanine level that was supposed to be a new independent subway connecting Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens. It just never got built, but they have a few of the stations' mezzanine levels built, ready for the lines that just were never built.
Be like a great nightclub or a wine
Yes.
cellar.
Actu-
They could do a lot of stuff with it.
Actually, one or two of the movies have made films on some of the disused stations through
Boy,
the years.
I'd love to see that. I mean, that's just a part of history that has been hidden for years and years and years and years.
The another little trivial piece of information is the West 4th Street Washington Square station in Greenwich Village. When you walk upstairs, you do not see a West 4th Street. There is no West 4th Street at that station, yet it's called West 4th Street. It turns out the planners were planning to build a South 4th Street station in Brooklyn. So they wanted to have it match the names, South 4th Street, West 4th Street. Yet there really isn't a street named West 4th Street when you come upstairs.
Fascinating. Now, I know the Transitory has, they run the old subway trains, memorabilia tours. Or
Yes, yes.
Tell us a little about
They're
that.
called,
That's
they're
pretty
called fan
interesting.
trips, and even around the holiday period, they will take a few of the trains from the Transit Museum, since they are actual trains, and they'll run them in what's called revenue service on some of the lines for passengers. And people really have no idea what they're looking at. For example, the old rattan seats that would be damaging to clothing
Yes.
if they if you sat down on them the wrong way. Those subway cars are what they run on these nostalgic trips.
My wife tells me a story that she would sit down in these rattan seats and the stockings would go, right? And then that would be another pair of stockings.
Right.
And if you were Will Chamberlain, they had those fans.
Fans, overhead
and God
fans,
forbid,
right.
you're a tall guy, you'd be decapitated.
So, right, that brings up the other point of air conditioning. The planners refused to air condition the subway. They said it's not possible because every time the subway car, think about it, would pull into a station, the doors would open and all the nice cool air would come out of the train and the air conditioning would be gone. So they refused to air condition the trains. However, the PATH system in New Jersey, which is a sister subway line, announced air-conditioned trains and demonstrated air-conditioned trains, which then led to New York City having no choice but to finally air-condition the trains. And it really was phenomenal, coming from fans blowing hot air in the middle of July to nice, cool air conditioning. I guess we take it for granted today.
Now, the New York City subway system, is that the oldest system, or is there
No, it's
older
older.
than London?
Oldest in the world is London, but I think the oldest in America is Boston. The original,
Really?
what's originally known as the Green Line in Boston. More of a subway trolley combination than an actual train, but that opened prior to 1904.
No, I know the one in London opened, I guess, about in the 1860s.
The first
around that-
tunnel under the Thames River was in the 1860s, but the first actual electrified subways came about in probably the 1890s.
Now, what I find interesting about the London system is that the system here in New York has the third rail going to the side of the track, but the
Right.
London one, just like the Lionel trains,
Exactly.
have a center
Yes, they
third
do.
rail.
The third rail on the tubes in London is in the middle of the track, just like our beloved Lionel trains has that center rail for the electricity.
You think Lionel stole that idea?
It's quite possible.
Now, we'll talk about the Redbirds, which tell us about that and the fate of the Redbirds.
Right, so the Redbirds were a classic fleet of 1950s subway cars that were rebuilt in the 1980s, and they were, at the time they were rebuilt, they were painted this really very pretty red color. So they affectionately became known as the Redbirds. Well, the entire fleet of Redbirds was retired at one time, and the planners had no idea what to actually do with these train cars. They couldn't recycle them anymore. They had already been rebuilt. There was nothing to save. So someone had the idea that they would just create an offshore reef, a barrier reef of subway cars, and that's exactly what they did 30, 40 miles out to sea. It's now become attractive to wildlife to actually use it as a nesting place and an actual reef.
And they sort of have a reef of old tokens, right?
Exactly. That was the fate of the Redbirds.
What I find interesting is the subway system is now an entertainment system. You have all the street performers and incredible.
But there's an actual formal process for getting many of these street performers. Once a year in Grand Central Station, they actually have auditions. And you audition, and then you're given a specific station and time of day when you are legally allowed to be performing. And it actually makes the chaos more organized. Since you know at certain times of day you're going to see very good musicians playing
Absolutely.
in a very organized fashion. And the musicians I've seen or audition are very good in pretty much every genre of music.
My wife mentioned, I think, that Joshua Bell, the violinist, who's very, very famous, got started playing in the New York City subway system.
Of course.
And this guy, is incredible. He's now playing the PATH trains. He's so successful. But I think, how did you get interested in the whole thing of the history of subways? What
Okay, well, I've
started
been riding the subways for 45 years, since 6th grade, and I always wanted to know why things were where they were, when they were built, because I always like to know everything about my environment. And since I'm on the subways every single day, what better thing to know about? And there's a whole collection of books.
Oh.
There's a great library of history of the subway systems for people that are interested in it that will give you all the information about truly a remarkable engineering achievement and something that's made New York City what it is today.
So most people, it's a chore to take the subway. Go, oh my God, I gotta take the subway to
Right,
you.
I
It's
look
like a
forward to it.
joy
I look forward
take
to
the
it, yeah.
subway, right? Yeah. I have a picture of the old station at City Hall.
Yeah,
that's pretty. Tell us about that. That's pretty
so
incredible.
this station was where the original subway would loop around and head back uptown. And it was only used for a few years because very quickly the subway was expanded beyond the station. So instead of destroying the station, they've kept it intact, and it's available for tours. And it's very ornate. There are chandeliers.
Wow.
There's mosaic artwork. It's just a beautiful piece of architecture that has been preserved by the city.
Okay. Is that available for bar mitzvahs and weddings?
But again, transitmuseum.org will probably be your best way to get the opportunity to go on the trips.
Quick story, I only have 1 minute. When I was a kid, they were tearing down the 3rd Avenue well around 1958. And they had a beautiful porcelain sign that said "To Uptown Trains" on the staircase. And I said, I have to have a souvenir. I said to my dad, can you help me take it down? My dad said, I'm a doctor, I'd get into trouble if I helped you. But he was in the getaway car. I took a screwdriver, undid it, took the sign. I have it today, and it's one of 6 in the world, and I would say it's probably worth about $3,000.
Right, of
if
course.
you can find them.
Yeah, the original subway signage, as it's called, they were works of art in themselves.
Exactly.
Today, maybe it's a little more banal lettering. It's too, but that's
And it had that
great collectibles.
Finger pointing up to the train.
Of course.
Anyway, we got to wrap it up. Neal, so quickly.
So nice to be
where'd
here,
your time
I know.
go? Neal Weiss, subway historian, Lionel train guy. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming back.
Thank
and
you
this
very
is Mike
much.
Sobel saying good night to you, and especially